Welcome to American History Lesson 21. The Idealism of the 1920s. Our lesson objectives are: identify and understand how regional lifestyles contributed to clashing ideologies, identify the growing influence and impact women had in America, identify how wealth influenced and changed Americans' everyday lives, identify important contributions to American entertainment and culture. The Clash of Cultures. The 1920 census showed that for the first time, more Americans lived in towns and cities than in the country. The 1920s sped the process of urbanization. New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia became huge cities, and 65 others had more than 100,000 people. As 2 million people a year left their farms, city values began to replace small-town values to dominate the nation's ideals. The transition was not always easy. One problem concerned prohibition, which would halt the creation and selling of alcohol and was favored by many rural people and opposed by many city dwellers. In 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was voted in and prohibition became law. However, the effort to stop drinking was doomed. The government did not have enough law officers to enforce the law. Illegal nightclubs sprang up across the country, while people began making their own illegal liquor. Others bought from bootleggers, and this resulted in large sums of money flowing to organized crime. By the middle of the decade, only 19% of Americans supported prohibition. It would remain a law until 1933. The country saw a revival of Christian fundamentalism. Christian fundamentalists believed that every word in the Bible was the literal truth. Religious revivals and preachers drew large crowds, especially in the South and West. Soon, fundamentalists clashed with science in the Scopes trial. Fundamentalists who rejected the scientific theory of evolution persuaded some states to outlaw the teaching of that theory in schools. Teacher John Scopes protested the law by openly teaching the subject. The trial brought famous attorneys and large crowds to a small Tennessee town. After Scopes was found guilty, the state Supreme Court reversed the conviction. The beginning of female empowerment. The new urban culture influenced many women to demand greater freedom, symbolized by the flapper. These young women wore shorter skirts, shorter hair, more jewelry, and more makeup than was accepted before. They smoked cigarettes, drank alcohol, and visited many illegal nightclubs. Not all young women were flappers, of course. Many felt caught between the old values and the new. Many women across America were adopting new roles at work. More women worked outside the home than before the war. They had many different jobs, but hundreds of thousands became teachers and nurses, secretaries, or sales clerks. Wherever they worked, women still faced discrimination. The 1920s began trends that continue today, identifying jobs as women's or men's work and paying women less than men. Married women generally did not work outside the home. Those who did work outside the home found it difficult to balance the demands of both work and family. Women experienced changes at home. Married women had fewer children than before. Ready-made clothes and labor-saving devices made housework easier. Other changes affected families, but sometimes they rebelled. Marriages were more often the result of the two partners' choice, not their parents' arrangements. Divorce became more common, with the rates almost doubling. More teenagers stayed in school than before, but sometimes rebelled against parental supervision. Education, entertainment, and culture of the 1920s. With prosperity and the need for a more educated workforce, more students received a high school education. High schools changed, offering vocational training for future workers and home economics for future homemakers. Educators met the challenge of teaching the millions of children of immigrants, many of whom did not know English. As a result, an increasing number of people could read. With these increased demands, school costs rose dramatically. American tastes were shaped by mass media. The number of people who read newspapers increased sharply, and national magazines grew as well. Despite the power of the printed word, the most powerful of the mass media was radio. It grew into national networks that offered programming to many millions. The growing prosperity of the 1920s gave Americans more money to spend and more leisure time to spend it. Fads swept the nation. The growing entertainment industry meant dollars were spent on tickets to sporting events in larger amounts than before, and athletes in many sports set new records. One famous athlete was baseball's Babe Ruth, who was famous for the number of home run hits. America's biggest hero was pilot Charles A. Lindbergh, who amazed the nation in 1927 by flying alone across the Atlantic Ocean. Fun fact, Charles Lindbergh was also the first pilot to fly a solo, nonstop flight from Washington, D.C. to Mexico City. Lindbergh also championed early efforts to start a space program and helped create the artificial heart. He would be Time's first Man of the Year in 1927. Americans by the hundreds of thousands found entertainment in movie theaters. For most of the decade, movies were silent. In 1927, Hollywood released The Jazz Singer, which was the first major talking pictures. Advances in technology allowed entertainment leaders to add speech and sound to movies. Movies like magazines and radio helped create a new national culture. Many artists contributed to a changing American culture. Playwright Eugene O'Neill dramatized family conflicts. Composers George Gershwin and Aaron Copland wrote music that combined jazz rhythms with classical forms. Sinclair Lewis, the first American to win a Nobel Prize in Literature, wrote best-selling novels that criticized the shallow life of middle-class Americans. F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel showed the dark underside of the flashy life of the 1920s. Dorothy Parker, Edith Wharton, and other women writers added a unique perspective in their work. African Americans and their influence on the 1920s. In the 1920s, hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved to the cities of the North. In this great migration, they hoped to leave behind racial violence and unemployment. By 1929, 40% of all African Americans lived in cities. This did not solve racial problems as racial riots erupted in the North. W.E.B. Du Bois, president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, protested racial violence. Another NAACP official, James Weldon Johnson, spearheaded the organization's effort to get Congress to pass a law to put an end to the lynching of African Americans. While the law never passed, the number of lynchings did decrease. Marcus Garvey voiced a message of Black pride that appealed to many African Americans. Garvey promoted the formation of Black-owned businesses. He urged many African Americans to return to Africa. Harlem, a section of New York City, became home to a rebirth of African American culture called the Harlem Renaissance. Writers Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston, among others, wrote moving poems, plays, and novels portraying the difficulties and pleasures of Black life. Paul Robeson won renown as an actor. Musicians Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Bessie Smith delighted audiences with jazz and blues. This great decade of social and cultural change would soon be overshadowed by national economic developments. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation. The author's surname and the date of publication within parentheses, straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.